In the challenge is the growth. In the loss, there is gain. In the new is the hope. In the memories, we remain. Until the end, which we know is just another means to becoming more of who we are meant to be. For those who hear the call, Wistira's venture presents a task that has never been conquered. Wistira's rightful heirs disappeared long before anyone can remember. The week of the Solna moon, every 10 years, provides the means to find a new heir. The physical, mental, and emotional tasks of the venture are meant to sift and refine those seeking this glory. Layla has been prepared for this mission, though she will not remember her training and go by a different name. Envision, written by Jodi Sommers. Dedication. She goes by many names, trying to find her real one. If you, too, are looking for answers to questions you don't know you have, if you have needs you don't know to miss, welcome. We have been waiting for you. Chapter 1. Knowing something cognitively is not the same as knowing it. She knew her mission, but the unknown of how or if she would succeed weighed on her. She knew she was wasting the last of her limited time, and tried to decide if she should ignore her fears and check on the others, or if her last few minutes should be spent trying to untangle her black web of a mind. Knowing she would not have a second chance to study herself, she chose the latter and left the training room to be alone. She climbed the stairs to the roof. Stepping onto the roof, she did not see the view around her. Each thought of the unknown added to her pressure, and she dramatically muttered to herself, "Get a grip." She knew her overactive mind would be one of the most challenging aspects of her mission. They were all well trained on their weaknesses and how they would need to overcome and incorporate them. She felt the panic start and instinctively threw her arms wide open to her side. She knew the procedures. It almost started to work. But her mind quickly reminded her that she would not remember the coping skills on her mission. Page break. Standing before the door leading to her mission, she wondered again if she was ready. She had finished her training and been approved. She knew her mission was custom designed for her, which may be why she was so hesitant. Something was unnerving about knowing everything was designed to prepare her for her future. How could anyone ever really be ready? There were too many questions and too many unknowns. Trying to focus on what she wanted, she stepped forward, willing herself to be prepared. Page break. "Walk with the river," she chanted to herself as she walked calf deep in the water. Walk with the river. It was freezing. The first snow was just beginning to fall. She needed to get as far as she could before she couldn't use it to hide her scent. One step after another was all she would allow herself to focus on. She had already fallen once. She could not afford to fall again. She knew she wouldn't be missed until dinner the next night. Her father was on a trip, so the next 2 days were vital before he would loose the dogs. "Father," she said under her breath, terrified. She would try to make sense of her governess Palef's letter only after she was far enough away to be safe. "Safe," she chattered, her breath temporarily blinding her as she fought for balance. "Okay, no more talking, just walk." Slipping on an uneven rock, she stumbled forward and fell to her knees. The freezing water made her panic, and she flung herself towards the riverbank. She almost breached it when she heard Palef's voice. "What would happen if you walked across this flower on the floor?" In her mind, she remembered Palef on the other side of a floor full of flour. She was remembering one of the earliest games they had played together. She knew if she walked across the flour, she would leave footprints, and the game would end. She remembered thinking the fastest way to the cookies was to walk across the flour. But Paleth reminded her there would be no cookies if she left footprints. Shaking from the cold, but seeing the blanket of snow, she knew she had to fight the panic and stay in the freezing water. Think. Think. I'm just so cold. No, think. Forcing herself to the present and ignoring the cold, she racked her mind for any advice that would be helpful. She had spent too much time in the shallow water and had not gotten far. She knew she couldn't bear the cold much longer. She stumbled towards the middle of the river before she could talk herself out of it and let herself be swept away. Sputtering and coughing, she struggled, unaware of how far down the river she went. When she knew she could go no further, she used the last of her energy to swim to the side. The weight of her dress pressed her down as she stumbled up the bank. Hands too cold to grab onto the weeds, she slipped and fell twice before summiting the ridge. Her first clear image was of a cabin not far from the river. She saw the smoke from the chimney and willed herself towards it. She was almost delirious and recklessly threw herself forward in jerky movements to get there. She realized she didn't know whose cabin she was heading towards, and fear diverted her to the barn. She knew she was in danger of dying and forced herself to focus on the barn. 20 feet, 19 feet, 18 feet. Stumbling to it, she threw herself on the door, but her hands were too stiff to open the latch. Helplessly, she banged her hands on the latch, but it would not open. She had to get them warm long enough to open the latch. How? Jamming her fingers in her mouth, she pleaded with them to work, but they would not stay warm long enough to grab the latch. Starting to be delirious, she saw her father's horse, Storm Rider, come into her mind. It had been hard to get him to take her into the river. Paleth's letter had told her how to do it. Riding bareback, she had successfully led him to the water without reins, but without the apple, she would never have got him to step into the water. He had reached his head back for the apple as she dismounted and quickly got off. She had watched him get out and immediately relieve himself. That was it. She knew how to warm her hands, but she had just slumped into the door and couldn't get up again. You must get up. You must move very quickly. She was not allowing a second more of the deathly rest to settle on her. She threw open the latch, opened the door, and removed her clothing before her hands froze again. It was still daylight, and she could see the ladder to the loft in the darkened barn. Grabbing her frozen belongings, she climbed the ladder and covered herself with hay. Her senses were returning. She hadn't noticed they were gone until she heard the low mooing of a cow and felt the hay stabbing at her. Poking her head out of her nest, she smelled the air. Yes, definitely a barn. There would be a milking soon. It was hard to gauge time, but it was still light, so it was probably around dinner time for the second milking. Her mind raced. Would the farmer see her entrance? Was there any track snow melting and leaving a trail to the loft? She reached out to feel her clothes, sopping wet. More rustling below and a short bleat let her know sheep were also in the barn. She planned to stay in her nest until after the milking, then sneak down and see how friendly the sheep and cows were, and if they would lend her some of their warmth. Page break. She must have fallen asleep. The opening of the door quickly brought her back to where she was. She heard heavy boots kicking the door frame to remove the extra snow. Swinging a bucket and placing a stool, she held her breath, listening for clues as to who was below. She knew she could trust no one and must not be seen. How would she get out of the barn without leaving footprints? How had her footprints not been seen? How much snow was out there, and how deep would it be in the morning? Each question brought more questions, and she wondered if she should return to her warm bed before her father returned. What are you thinking? You cannot ever go back. You must not even think of it. She heard the stool squeak and the slow shuffle of something heavy being carried. She knew she shouldn't look, but had to see who was down there. She crawled out of her nest and stayed hunkered down as she peered under the loft railing. It was a young person. A heavy hat hung down around their shoulders, and she couldn't be sure if it were a boy or a girl, but looking at their size, They, too, couldn't be older than 11 or 12. She watched them put the bucket down, to open the door, and saw by the fading light the snow coming down in heavy, wet flakes. The cold breeze from the door being opened drove her back to her nest as the door closed. The loft seemed darker now, and she knew she had limited light. Willing herself out of her nest again, she grabbed her still frozen belongings and hurried down the ladder. She could see the sheep huddled together in the corner. As her eyes adjusted, she saw a tall black horse and the milk cow. She was hungrier than she had ever been, and looked around to see if there was anything edible. Finding nothing but animal grain, she noticed the grain scoop and quickly blew it off as she scooted the stool under the cow. She rubbed her hands to warm them and patted the cow's side like she had seen the stable hands do. The big brown eyes of the cow looked at her as if to ask what she was doing. She hopped off the stool to get a handful of hay. Satisfied, the cow munched as she resumed her spot on the stool and began to hum the song the stable hands sang to the cows at home. She thought of the words as she hummed. Rivers and rolling hills, reaching for the sky. Seek the mountains to which the birds fly. I'll be waiting here for your return to tell me the stories I have yet to learn. The milk had released surprisingly quickly, and only a little had spilled as it splashed against the scoop. Staying seated, she eagerly drank the warm milk, not daring to move and lose any of it. Thanking the cow and returning the stool, she gave her another handful of hay. Gathering her wet belongings, she shook them. The sound startled the horse, and the wide eyes seemed to peer out of pure blackness. "Sorry," she murmured, colder from touching the wet pile. She looked longingly at the fluffy white sheep. They seemed so content and warm. Stepping closer to see better, she got an idea. Slowly moving towards them, she found herself close enough to feel the warmth of their body heat. She gently hung her dress as close to them as she could without disturbing them. Walking back, she came across the eyes that seemed to hang in the darkness again. She reached her hand out to comfort the horse. Meeting no resistance, she ran her hand down the horse's neck. Her hand met an unexpected sensation. What was that? A blanket? She giggled in relief. She felt torn about taking it from the horse, but also so grateful at the prospect of warmth for the night. "Can we share this?" she whispered. She felt a nudge in the dark and took the gesture as a kind acceptance. Drawing it around her shoulders, the warmth still on it. "Oh, thank you," she crooned, leaning into the horse's warm body. The horse lowered to the ground and she followed, seeking the heat. Laying beside the horse, she opened the blanket to cover them both and quickly fell asleep. When the morning came, she went to check her clothing. Her dress was a little damp, but better than it would have been. Returning the blanket to the horse, she was about to slip out when the cow mooed. She knew it was still early enough that nobody was coming, but she felt guilty taking more milk. The cow mooed again, and she lost her reservation. Repeating the procedure from the night before, she gave her thanks with more hay and left the barn. The snow glistened under the brightness of the moon, and she was grateful to be able to make out her surroundings. She could hear the river to her right and knew it was just below the bank. Looking around, she could see the tree line, which appeared black and scary. She was glad Palif's instructions had been to follow the river to the caves. Stepping away from the barn, she felt exposed under the moonlight. She was mindful of the sound of her footsteps in the snow and knew without looking that she was leaving a trail. Nothing could be done, and she hoped it would be the child that came again to milk the cow and that her footprints would go unnoticed. She knew she couldn't be more than 2 miles from home. She hoped Palif's plan had worked and that her father would look for her in a different direction. She would be okay and no longer alone if she could reach the meeting spot before nightfall. With new motivation, she walked on, following the moonlight and the sound of the river. Page break. She had never walked this far before, and though the snow wasn't too deep, it had factored into the energy required to keep going. She knew she had to be close, but had felt that way for hours. Maybe she had misjudged how far she had gone in the water. Nothing else made sense. The letter had told her to follow the river, and she would come across the caves. but no caves were in sight. It was a bright day, which helped her mood and the temperature, but it was still freezing, and she was heading into a patch of trees so the temperature would drop. Plodding along, she did not see the rock under the snow that caused her to trip. Painfully, she got to her knees and then slowly rose. Shaking the snow off her hands and clothes, she looked around. She had been so focused on her steps that she had not noticed the beauty. She knew the river was just below the trees, and she listened for a moment to its running sound. Grateful not to be in it, she continued walking, noticing other points of beauty. The snow had rested so serenely on the trees that everything was white and lovely. She could see patches of vivid blue sky through the trees. Mindful to stay close enough to hear the river, another memory returned. She was blindfolded and following the sound of a pot with dry beans. Palef would shake the beans to help her know which way to keep going. So many memories, so many games. But why? She couldn't remember life without Palef, but could barely remember her mother. She knew Palef had come to her to be her governess right before her mother had gone on the trip that she had never returned from. Listening to the river, she continued deeper into the woods. Palef, why didn't you come with me? She knew why. Palef's letter had explained it. Palef and a girl from the village, dressed like her, were to go by carriage north on a shopping trip. She was to wait in her room until the staff went to the drawing room for their evening assignments. She was then to slip down the stairs to the stable and ride Storm Rider to the river. She had never questioned Palef's games before, but betraying her father had never been part of them. Palef had taught her a word many years before, Hashad. She had told her that if she ever used that word, it meant she was unsafe. Palef had ended the short letter of instructions with the words, Father, Hashad. As she stumbled through the snow-covered woods, she wondered why, with so few words, she had trusted Palef over her father. When she had found the letter, a small flute on a chain, and an apple, she had known immediately to follow every instruction precisely. When it was time, she had dressed in her warmest clothes, snuck down the stairs, and made it to the stable undetected. What would have happened if someone had seen her? They had known her whole life. Why was she hiding from them? Her mind was troubled. She knew something, but couldn't remember what it was. It would not come. She was cold from the forest shadows, so she moved quickly to return to the light. Page break. The sun was starting to drop behind the mountains, and she still wasn't to the caves. Over and over she reminded herself that the instructions had said to follow the river until she came to the caves. She had never been to the caves, and she started to worry she had somehow passed them without knowing it. No, she was sure she had not seen any caves. Passing through a cluster of trees, she felt like she walked into a wall of cold. Another memory. A few nights before, she had been eating dinner with her father. When she told him she had opened a geode, her father had looked down the table piercingly at her and asked what she had said. She knew immediately she had made a mistake. She knew she was never to tell her father what she was learning or doing unless he asked, and then only to tell him about the book she was reading. She looked to Palef for help, but she was in the corner working on her needlework as if she had not heard. She knew Palef had heard, but she also knew she was on her own to answer his question. She had seen his anger, and she knew to lie. She gave her best smile and said, yes, and it was purple on the inside, just like the boy said it would be. Her father snarled as he asked, and who was this boy that gave you that geode? She acted confused for a moment before responding, I don't know his name. He came by asking for food, and I went to the kitchen to get him some. When I returned, he took the food and handed me the geode. He said if I cracked it open, it would be purple inside. Her father glared at her for what seemed like minutes before returning to eating. She thought she had done a wonderful job covering for Palef, who had actually given her the geode. But she could tell by looking at Paleth that Paleth was very concerned, though her face showed no emotion as she continued to sew. Page break. Keeping herself focused, she could barely stay ahead of the panic she felt as the last of the sun disappeared. She did not know how she would survive the night. She had seen the bend in the river before the sun went behind the mountains, and she followed it into the darkness of the mountain's shadow. The moon had not come up yet, and she did not like the fear that was following her. Paleth had no room for fear, and had taught her early that fear was like a greedy dog. The more you gave it, the more it wanted. I will not feed the greedy dog. Following the bend, there was an opening into a valley and enough light to see rock formations that surely had to have caves. Exhausted, she ran, happy to be ending her long journey. The shadows of the rocks made it hard to see any caves, but she had been told to play her flute outside the cave and someone would meet her. Pulling up the chain that lay around her neck, she found the little flute Paleth had left with the instructions and began to blow on it. She knew she must be imagining it, but it seemed like the rocks had moved. She watched as a light grew brighter and brighter from one of the rocks. She could tell the light was a lantern. A male voice beckoned for her to come.